Welcome to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. Mexico is facing its worst crisis in decades. With the forced disappearance of 43 students and dozens of bodies discovered in clandestine graves, there's a large part of the population that no longer believes that peace is possible. Is peace a realistic goal in a country like Mexico? How do we create a culture of peace? To talk about these issues today, we are very fortunate to have with us Jody Williams, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. Jody won the prize in 1997 for the anti-landmines campaign, and she's been an activist for peace throughout the world since then. Jody, thank you so much for being with us here on Interview from Mexico.
It's a pleasure.
Jody, I wanted to start out with the definition of peace. You've said that it's not just the absence of conflict. How would you define peace today?
Sure. I think it's really hard for people to understand the meaning of sustainable peace, which is what I think about when I think about peace. It's not simply the absence of armed conflict or war. It's based really on a different concept entirely of security. Instead of national security, which of course is to guarantee the security of the structure of the state, it's based on a conception of security that has as its center the well-being of the people of a society. And those are very, very, very different concepts. When you think about state security, the state itself, the apparatus, considers that if it's in good shape and the people of the country are at peace, more or less, everything's fine. The concept of human security does not look at security that way. It's if the basic needs of the majority of the population of a country are not met, there is not security. If you don't have education for your children, if you don't have access to health care, if you don't have a decent place to live, if you don't have a job that is dignified, that pays you enough so that you can support your own family, there are societal tensions that ultimately do lead to conflict, whether or not it's open conflict of war, or like what we see here in Mexico, the generations of oppression of the haves against the have-nots, now with the layer of the war on drugs since 2006 that has broken everything out into the open.
Yeah, so we're seeing more actual conflict here on top of those structural tensions.
Exactly.
Well, here in Mexico, one of the problems is that after this war on drugs broke out and violence has become such a normal part of daily life, many people can no longer even envision what peace looks like. Is peace even a viable goal these days?
I think that's a valid question. Sometimes I feel a bit of desperation. You look at the situation in Mexico, you look at the femicide in Honduras and here, of course. You look at what's happening with ISIS in the Middle East, Ukraine. It seems when you're in the middle of this type of chaos that peace is only a utopian dream of people who want to strum the guitar and sing Kumbaya. And yes, if you look at it that way, at this moment, it doesn't seem viable. To change the situation for the future, you have to start even in the midst of this chaos to get people to think differently about violence and the response to violence. And I think that's the big challenge. When you're surrounded by oppression, you feel the oppression every day. It's very hard to envision how the system of oppression can possibly ever change so that there's real sustainable peace with functioning justice and actual equality. I can understand the despair. Sometimes I feel it, as I said, but I refuse to give up because I know change is possible. I've been part of it with the landmine campaign.
You have, certainly have been. Well, you mentioned before the war on drugs. And this difference between the concept of human security and national security. What we're seeing is that in many cases, at least from the point of view of the government, and this is certainly true in Mexico, somehow the concept of peace has become synonymous with security, and security is interpreted in a dangerous world as militarization.
Right.
How would you respond to that argument?
Unfortunately, I come from the United States, the most militaristic country in the world. There has been war perpetrated by my country for most of my life. And for a moment in time when the Soviet Union collapsed and the wall came down, many people in the world thought that things might be different. I didn't. I actually, because of the immense pressure and power of the military-industrial complex, which was not a word coined by hippies, it actually was coined by General Eisenhower as he left office, telling the people of the country to beware the military-industrial complex. When the Soviet Union collapsed, in order to justify that continued militarization, you had to have another enemy of equal global horror, right? Because you could find a communist behind every tree. So now you can find a Muslim terrorist behind every tree. And you also have the specific targets in the Middle East.
Or a drug trafficker.
Or a drug trafficker. And I think when 9/11 happened in the United States, it allowed a rebirth of militarization and the concept of security you're talking about. That if we're going to be safe from the narcos, and if we're going to be safe from the terrorists and every other evil in the world, we have to arm ourselves to the teeth. We have to be prepared to use those arms wherever. I mean, Mr. Obama, in my case, is willing to kill Americans with drones, for God's sakes. And here, since Mr. Calderon's beginning of the war on terror, and bringing the military into that war, of course people have desesperación, as we say in Spanish, which I can speak occasionally. It's totally understandable why people feel there's no out.
Jody, we were talking about how you build a culture of peace. Now, I know that since you won the Peace Prize, you started a new organization called the Nobel Women's Initiative, and that this organization, besides grouping the women who have won the Nobel Peace Prize, is dedicated to focusing on women's role in peace building. Can you describe that a little for us?
It's interesting at this moment in time when we had decided, the 6 women recipients of the prize, to create the Nobel Women's Initiative. And the whole purpose is to use the weight and prestige of the prize to support women working around the world for sustainable peace with justice and equality. And that came about through coincidence with the sudden desire of the world to at least talk about the need for women to really be involved in peace negotiations, peacekeeping, rebuilding a country after war. And I really believe that there is an intellectual understanding that if you do not include 50% of the population, women, in the processes of peace, in the processes of building a society that looks at the needs of everyone, not just the men in power, the world will be different. Now we're talking a lot about women and education, girls and education, and if you can educate a girl or a woman, it totally changes the economic dimension for that girl and that mother, because then with their education they can get a job, they can have their own independence and income, which helps bring about some gender equality. When a woman is totally dependent on the man for her, her money to keep her children alive, for example. It's very hard to have a more active role in creating peace. Or it's just creating a sustainable society, a society with justice, a society with the possibility of equality. But I believe that at this point, it's still too much lip service. We just recognized the 10th anniversary of UN Resolution 1325 in October, right? And 1325 is the supposedly breakthrough resolution for women in women, peace, and security, recognizing the need for women to be involved in security issues. And last week, which was beginning of November, Ban Ki-moon was talking about the wonders of 1325. And then a week later, he announced he was creating a panel to look at peace operations. 15 members of the panel. Guess how many are women? 3. I mean, we're shocked there are even 3. But how can he one week talk about the importance of women's involvement and a week later have a panel of 15 with 3 women? Which shows the tension, I think, in the world right now of the recognition of the rights of women and the equality of women and the necessity of women's active involvement in life to change how we look at security. And, the men in power and the patriarchal systems that just do not know how to accept that. But I think there are many routes to building, a peaceful society. It's what we see here in Mexico. How many? 150,000 in the streets on November 5th over the 43 students from Ayotzinapa and their families grieving, waiting to find the answer. And when I was listening to some of the speakers, there was one in particular, and it was a male, who spoke out and he said, we've lived so many years of oppression, so many years of disappearances, so many years of death, that for us it has become lo normal, the normal, the norm. And he said, but with these 43 students taken away the way they were taken away, with the state reacting with no reaction, we are no longer afraid.
Well, that's one of the things you talk about, this gap between some legal advances on the international level and, of course, here in Mexico, the government talks a lot about the new law of victims and legal advances within the framework. And yet we're seeing this complete gap between what's happening on the ground. And you mentioned grassroots mobilization. Well, what are some of the strategies that you've seen here and throughout the world, and particularly of women, that can move to close that gap and break down some of the real resistance in applying some of those new laws?
Well, one thing that I do notice is when women can't stand it anymore, the first thing we do is come together, which is very different from how a man responds to a situation. A man thinks about his own power and what he can do to advance his own power. Women, and I think the example of the Nobel Women's Initiative, for example, in the entire history of the Nobel Prize, there have been 16 women, and the minute we had 7, we recognized that, wow, look, there are this many of us. Why don't we get together and use our Nobelness to support women who, despite the oppression, are working to create sustainable peace and who are forcing the questions of justice and equality. And yesterday, which was the 6th of November, I was in a meeting with women who were sexually tortured by members of the state in the form of the Marines, the Navy, the police, and then some of them charged with crimes that they didn't commit in order to pressure them to not say anything. And listening to their...
Here in
Mexico. And listening to their stories, of course, is heart-wrenching. But then listening to them talk about how they decided to not feel shame by that situation, but take that and make it public, despite the shaming and everything that comes along with a woman when she talks about any sexual violence toward her. But to use it to talk to other women about their power, about their rights, about their ability to protest and take charge of, their lives. And when something happens to them, there is now this growing network here, which is Rompiendo el Silencio, which are the women who've decided to break the silence they were carrying and come together in a growing network to take on the state, to take on the police, to try to pressure the state to implement the beautiful laws that it talks about, but are nothing more than words on paper and totally irrelevant.
Well, Jody, that's a great example. Jody, you've come to Mexico, as you know, at a critical time. There are mass protests because of the disappearance of 43 students and the murder, apparently by police and members of organized crime, of 6 other persons. You were at the march the other day. What do you think of this situation? What have you seen so far?
Well, certainly one can only describe it as a moment of crisis. What I found amazing was the power. This is going to sound weird, but the energy power in the crowd in El Zócalo, where the march ended. And when I was sitting up on the platform waiting to say a few words, I found myself tremendously inspired on the one hand, and also wondering where it was going to go from there. When ultimately there is a resolution one way or the other for the families of what happened to their children. Where is all this energy going to go? I'm hoping that people have learned that moments of emotional breakout in a society do not bring about change unless you then take all of that energy and devise just a plan of action, which doesn't have to be rigid, but where different sectors of society, like the women we were just talking about, and students and unions, talk together about, what can we do with all this? How do we keep the pressure on the government in a way that forces the government to respond without having to be violent ourselves? Simply because human beings have the capacity for violence does not mean that we have to respond with violence. And I believe because of the militarization here, my own country, globally, that the desire to respond with violence it's even closer below the surface than normal, if you know what I mean. I think we have to seize this moment in time here in Mexico and in the world to train people to respond not with violence. You can feel violent, but take the violence and make it indignation against injustice, and use the indignation to pressure for change. It's not an easy thing to do, but the moment here is so ripe with that possibility that it's going to be fascinating to watch how the Mexican society takes this, or just has it be a moment of emotion, and when the parents accept whatever happens and it fizzles out, and then become numb against the oppression again until the next crisis. So there's a lot of hope there, a lot of hope.
Well, you mentioned injustice, and the clamor for the case of Ayotzinapa has been precisely for justice, and yet a lot of people don't automatically associate peace and justice. In a society with levels of impunity that we have here, I mean, what is that critical role of justice for peace?
When a country rules with pretty much total impunity, as in Mexico, since forever, let's be realistic, When people feel like they have no recourse to justice, that is one of the intensely destabilizing factors in the society. And we're seeing some of that, coming forth in a positive way at this moment, in my view, in the mass demonstrations and the calls for justice. But if the state continues in its obstinate path of, we're in power, we don't really care about you all, we'll throw you a few crumbs to make you shut up, and does not begin to address in a real fashion the impunity, there will not be peace in this country. Even if it's not open war, there will be this continued disappearances and extrajudicial murder, and the marriage between the politicians and the military and the police and the narcos will only grow stronger.
Well, let's end on that sign of hope that you saw in the march. And where do you think that can take us? What do you think the possibilities are?
I think they're tremendous. I really do. Because there is the call for justice. If the people who were in the marches take the call for justice seriously and force the government to really deal with this case in a way that brings justice for the families, that begins a change. You couple it with the women that we were just discussing who were saying, enough, we're not going to be quiet anymore. We were falsely accused, we were sexually tortured, we are pushing for justice. So if you get enough sectors, which we can see, there's all of this tension and activity out there, and it coalesces and as a common theme perhaps, an underlying common theme, even if it isn't spoken. It's for justice, an end to impunity, and equality. That alone, wow. You can change the world with that.
Jody Williams, thank you so much for being with us here on Interview from Mexico. And thank you for being with us. We'll be back next week on Interview from Mexico.